Charles "Lucky" Luciano, was deported from Havana, Cuba in 1947. At the time, the island was a hotbed of organized crime, controlled by various criminal organizations, including the French Corsican Mafia, the Cuban Mafia, the Italian-American Mafia, Vietnamese mafias, and others. These groups used Cuba as a hub for money laundering, prostitution, and drug trafficking, transforming it into a paradise for gangsters. Havana was home to notorious figures like Meyer Lansky, the Corsican Mafia, and the Trafficante crime family. Despite Luciano's power, he could not withstand the might of the United States government. Many believe the US wanted Luciano in Italy to use him as a contact point for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, in their fight against communism. The CIA was already collaborating with various organized crime groups, including the French Corsican Mafia, the Italian-American Mafia, and other syndicates. After being expelled from Cuba, Luciano traveled across Europe, holding meetings in London, Paris, Switzerland, and other parts of the continent. His goal was to dominate the European gambling operations by teaming up with the Corsican Mafia, British crime groups, and others. The black market was booming, and the Corsican Mafia was in its second phase of development, having moved away from their fascist predecessors. The CIA sought to align with the new Corsican leaders to counter threats and protect American interests. It's speculated that Luciano was tasked with modernizing these operations, leveraging his connections in Sicily and across Europe. This cooperation aimed to combat communism not only in Europe, but also in Africa, South America, and globally. In 1951, the world of organized crime was undergoing significant changes. Figures like Frank Costello were becoming more visible, with Costello appearing on the cover of Time magazine in 1949. This exposure highlighted the influence of organized crime in America, even as figures like J. Edgar Hoover denied its existence. Costello was dubbed the Prime Minister of the underworld, indicating his immense power. Meanwhile, Luciano, stuck in Italy, struggled to maintain his image amidst growing negative press. Henry Anslinger, whom Charlie always called Asslinger, Estes Kefauver, as well as others, had branded him one of America's most dangerous gangsters, a reputation he found increasingly difficult to shake. Further details on the rise and fall of the Corsican Mafia will be explored in my series on Carlos Marcello and Meyer Lansky. Charlie "Lucky" Luciano was determined to change his image, particularly in the eyes of the press. He embarked on various charitable endeavors, such as building hospitals and aiding the poor, especially those affected by natural disasters like volcanic eruptions. He ceased recruiting gangsters into his crime family in Sicily and instead focused on helping people become better businessmen and securing better opportunities for them. He also began setting up legitimate operations to further distance himself from his criminal past. However, Luciano's efforts were often overshadowed by his associations. Despite his personal disdain for the Corsican Mafia, he frequently met with high-ranking Corsican gangsters. He considered them one of the world's most dangerous syndicates, even more formidable than the Italian-American Mafia, which typically avoided entanglements with them. One exception was Carlos Marcello, who had good relationships with the Corsican Mafia. Luciano's interactions with various dubious individuals from America, many of whom were connected to organized crime and narco-trafficking, cast a shadow over his attempts to rehabilitate his image. Although he was never arrested or charged with drug trafficking, his associations led to rumors and accusations that he was still a powerful drug trafficker. These rumors were enough to prompt stories in the papers, causing Luciano continuous trouble with Italian, European, and American law enforcement agencies. He was subjected to strict curfews, constant surveillance, and restricted movements, which only added to his frustration. Despite these challenges, Luciano maintained a few friends in the press. He used these connections to share his side of the story, discussing the harsh treatment he endured and offering his opinions on the accusations against him. Luciano had previously helped Tom Dewey run for president, become governor, and performed other favors to secure his release from prison. He was well aware of the corruption in American politics. As Luciano's frustration grew, he began to speak more openly about the relationship between organized crime and politicians. Some speculate that his willingness to expose these connections ultimately led to his death. Despite his efforts to change his image, the persistent rumors and constant scrutiny left Luciano in a precarious position until the end. I'm going to present 2 interviews with Charlie Lucky Luciano. The first interview is from the Associated Press around 1953, a time when Luciano was under strict curfew. His movements were limited, and he was growing increasingly frustrated. Despite these constraints, Luciano found some success. He was making good money off the black market with his cousin, who was heavily connected to the Sicilian mafia. Together, they were raking in revenue from multiple streams. Luciano's businesses in America were still flourishing, and he was receiving his fair share. Although he was content with his financial situation, he was constantly battling the labels of drug trafficker, pimp, and gangster, which he vehemently denied. To improve his image, Luciano began giving interviews. I previously shared one of his last interviews, and now, as promised, I will present the first 2 interviews he ever gave. The first interview was conducted by Philip Clark of the Associated Press. The second interview appeared in Esquire magazine, which was owned by Hearst Newspapers, a publication with close ties to the Chicago outfit, the New York crime families, and Luciano himself. "There ain't no justice," declares Lucky Luciano by Philip Clark Rome, Associated Press. Charlie Lucky. Luciano, the graying ex-gangster, is thoroughly convinced there just ain't no justice. "Here I been living clean and proper ever since I got out of the jail in New York 4 years ago. And what do? They try to frame me on a narcotics rap and kick me out of Rome," he complained bitterly to reporters. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania, has lived a lush but uncomfortable life in the bright glare of publicity since his deportation to Italy in February 1946, after serving 10 years of a 30-year sentence for white slavery. Italian police have checked his every move. Last July 7th, they hauled him into Rome's dungeon-like Regina Coeli, Queen of Heaven jail, for questioning in connection with a vast dope smuggling ring. He was freed 9 days later, but ordered expelled from Rome as a crime threat. He must report to police in his Sicilian birthplace, tiny Lercara Fridi, in the hills near Palermo. Lucky has made no secret that next to New York's sidewalks, he likes Rome best. He quit the underworld entirely in 1946. At 51, the exiled New York vice lord is a living example of the ancient adage that crime does not pay. Not much, anyway. In his pleasanter moments, Luciano admitted he never had it better. Mysteriously, he has lots of money. No one knows quite how much. He has a Rome penthouse and a honey-haired Italian sweetheart, dancer Igea Lissoni, who says she loves him more than his money. But he also has a finely developed persecution complex that has scarred his flat Sicilian features with deep lines of worry. "They won't leave me alone," he cries, punching the air. "Everywhere I go, it's the same. Lucky is doing this, Lucky is doing that. The police keep prying into my life all the time. It's driving me sort of nuts." Luciano says he's mad at only one man, George Williams, chief of New York Customs. What's his name? Philip? No, Lucky. He was referring to the central character in the famous novella, The Man Without a Country. He blames Williams personally for the latest probe, which ended with his expulsion. "This guy Williams tried to put me in the can, kept me in jail for 9 days. They found out I was innocent, but still I got kicked out of the country." The past still haunts him. "The newspapers get everything twisted up," he moans. "They call me all sorts of bad names. They connect me with nightclubs, with dancing hostesses, with bakeries that make cakes with dope in the middle, with all sorts of crazy things. I don't need to do those sorts of things. I got enough money to get along. Now, I will present to you the second interview given to Esquire magazine, a publication that had a very good relationship with Charlie Luciano, the Chicago outfit, and other crime families. During the era when Luciano and his crew were starting to take over gambling operations, they collaborated with various newspapers to help them gain control over certain markets. The newspaper industry at that time was fraught with issues related to organized crime unions and faced fierce competition on the streets. This is where Luciano and the Chicago outfit provided assistance, ensuring continuous circulation and support. The Hearst newspaper, which owned Esquire magazine, began teaming up with organized crime, utilizing their gambling and racing wires to publish results and stay ahead of the competition. Esquire magazine, in particular, ran a story on Luciano that he always spoke highly of. He appreciated the journalist for being fair and honest, stating that it was the only time a newspaper ran a favorable article about him. Here is the article in full. On September 25, 1952, Harry J. Anslinger, U.S. Commissioner of Narcotics, made a speech before the Young Men's Board of Trade in New York. He said that a top official of the Italian government had confirmed to him a report that Charles "Lucky" Luciano is definitely involved in the international dope smuggling racket. The name of the top official was not disclosed. The next day, the newspapers headed this story: Italy confirms Luciano role in dope trade. 5 days later, United Press sent a dispatch from Rome. Italian narcotics officials charged today that former New York Vice Lord Charles "Lucky" Luciano is back in business and said, "We'll get him sure next year on income tax." The Italian officials who made the charge were not identified. In the ensuing weeks, as in all the years since his deportation, Luciano was frequently in the papers and always in connection with a narcotics story. Ex-Luciano Ade slain, hurled in Harlem gutter was the heading on a story describing the death of Eugene Giannini, one of 17 men nabbed as part of a huge dope ring linked to Luciano, a ring to which at least 6 gangland slayings were attributed. Last summer, when 3 suspects were arrested carrying 50 ounces of heroin valued at $21,250, newspaper readers learned that T-Men nab 3 as outlet for Luciano dope. The story underneath quoted jubilant Assistant U.S. Attorney Bungard as saying, "We have every reason to believe these men are connected directly with Lucky Luciano." Perhaps Mr. Bungard's cause for jubilation is substantial and is based on evidence sufficient to overcome any reasonable doubt that the arrested dope peddlers really were employed by Luciano. Perhaps the law enforcement agencies at last possess proof that Luciano's involvement is actual and not a dream stirred by the headline happy ones. And perhaps this will bring to an end the persistent speculation on whether Luciano is or is not the head of an international dope ring, speculation stimulated by statements before the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, by speeches before the United Nations, and by most newspapers in reporting the arrest of any group of narcotics dealers. I discussed this speculation with Luciano in Naples last summer. I had never met Luciano in New York. I was new to the Broadway beat when he was removed from circulation and sent to jail for white slavery. "That was 16 years ago," he said. "Yeah, I was 38 when they sent me away. I served 10 years, and it's been 6 years since I came here. 40, 16. Figure it up. Yeah, I'm 55. He looks younger. Underworld and hoodlums are Luciano's own words for the region of his past activities and for its citizens. He uses them instead of criminals and gangsters, words which sound unpleasant to him. "I like Hoover," said Luciano. "Yeah, Hoover." For a moment I couldn't tell whether he meant Herbert or J. Edgar Hoover. The ex-president of the United States lives at the Waldorf Astoria, where Luciano lived. The Waldorf, by the way, is the only place in America for which I heard Luciano express specific longing. A few minutes earlier, making his prediction on the outcome of the November election, Luciano had said, with an assurance observed only in fervent Republicans, "Ike, Ike, Ike, all the way." He flicked his wrist when he said it, a backhand slap at the wind, which is his typical gesture in dismissing all dissent. "You know why I like Hoover," he said. "Hoover's no friend of the hoodlums or the underworld. I like him because he never makes announcements about what he's going to do. He never says a guy is tied up in a racket and he's going to grab him for it. Nah. None of that yappity stuff. A guy does something, Hoover grabs him." It was clear now that he was speaking of J. Edgar Hoover. "No announcements. He just grabs him. He does not shoot no mouth off." "Efficiency," said Luciano in admiration. "He's got efficiency. I like that. But this other guy, this Anslinger, yappity. He makes announcements about me. But what does he do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Luciano thinks it is Anslinger's fault that he is constantly harassed by the law enforcement agencies of Italy. He believes that it was Anslinger, a veteran of much experience in the fight against narcotics dealers, who got the Italian police to limit his movements to the Naples area. That it was Anslinger, as American representative on the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations, who persuaded Italian officials to pick up his passport. "I respect law and order," Luciano said. I could not contain a grin. Luciano smiled. "What I mean," he explained, "is that I know if you violate law and order, you got to pay for it. Got to pay. You play with fire? Be ready to get burnt. But if you don't do nothing, why should you be getting burnt if you don't do nothing?" A few days earlier, he had surrendered his Italian passport, by government request. He had held this passport for 18 months, he said, but never used it. "Why'd they pick it up?" said Luciano. "Why? What was I going to do with it? Escape? Me? Where to?" He had hoped to see Paris and London someday, he said, but now no longer could. He could not see even the rest of Italy. "Florence, Venice, you've seen more of Italy than I did. I can't go nowheres now," said Luciano. "I'm barred out of this world. Yup, they barred me out of this world." I met Luciano by accident. My wife and I and our 2 older sons had spent 6 weeks in Europe and the Middle East. We came down to Naples on the Rapido from Rome to spend 3 days there before boarding the SS Constitution for the voyage home. In the lobby of the Hotel Excelsior, while I was signing the register, I saw a New Yorker I know. In the days following repeal, when I first met him, he was a press agent for a popular nightclub controlled by one of the Broadway mobs. When the club closed, he moved to other fields. Today his business interests, I'm sure, are wholly legitimate. He too had just arrived in Naples for only 1 day. He said he had an appointment to dine with Luciano and asked if I cared to go with him. "Charlie's avoiding all newspaper men now," he said, "but you're with me, and that'll be enough for him. I'll tell him I'm bringing you, just you, not your family, of course." We were to meet at 8:30. "Wear slacks and sports shirt, no jacket, no tie," my friend said. "That's what I'm wearing, just slacks and sports shirt." I met him downstairs, and we walked along the waterfront. The night was warm, and there was no breeze from the Bay of Naples. It was a short walk to the Hotel Vesuvio. Luciano was standing on the sidewalk in front of the hotel. He was talking to a short, baldish man. Both were wearing ties and jackets. 2 ladies were with them. My friend introduced me to Luciano, who then presented his companions. The other man, an American, seemed familiar to me. "Oh, I've seen you around," he said. "Here, there." He would not say where. I told the ladies that I had been asked to wear slacks and a sports shirt. Luciano smiled and took off his jacket and tie and gave them to the other man, who then removed his own jacket and tie and took the clothes back into the Vesuvio. "Well, where'll we eat?" Luciano asked. "How about the Z. Teresa?" I'd been told in Rome that I could find him at the Z Teresa almost every night. We walked across the street and down the steps to the restaurant, one of several along the bay front. He was taller than I had expected him to be. He walked unhurriedly, as old men do, or the indolent, or those on long vacation. His shoulders slope. When he talks, he gives an impression of authority and of contained violence. He smiles often, and sometimes in anger, irony, or disbelief, the smile is fixed, exposing the place where two upper side teeth are missing. We sat at one of the tables outdoors. Some of the other diners recognized him, nodded in greeting him, and then paid no further attention. "Let me tell you one thing," my New York friend suddenly said, with a note of desperate earnestness. "You are sitting with one of the finest human beings I have ever known." I was astonished at the bluntness of this approach. "And what they're doing to him is a crime." "A crime, I tell you," my friend continued. "I haven't much money, but I'll put up $10,000 for anyone who can prove that Charlie is guilty of anything now. Anything. Even violating a traffic law. 10,000. The short, baldish man was not to be outdone. "Me too," he said. 10,000. Luciano smiled and flicked his wrist to halt their talk. "Cut it. Wait a minute," he said. "What are you trying to do? Make a Dreyfus case out of me? You can't. I'm no Dreyfus. Take it easy." He signaled to the waiter, who took our orders. Then Luciano glanced at the other tables. "Thieves," he said. "Naples is full of thieves. You got to watch out for them." He was referring to the local guides, he said. They often bring tourists to the places he frequents. The guides point him out, as they do the old castle and the opera house, and then the tourists ask for his autograph. "Sometimes 200 autographs at a time," he said. "When I hear of a ship coming in now, I go to a different joint. What are you supposed to do when they come up to you and ask for an autograph? So, you give it to them." He returned to the announcements by Commissioner Anslinger. "What about the presumption of innocence until they can convict? What about that? Why does he yap? If I'm doing something, then why don't they pick me up for it? The two governments are friendly, ain't they?" Commissioner Anslinger had pointed out that Luciano could not be extradited to America for crimes committed in Italy. "Italy gets a lot of help from the American government," said Luciano. "If they got something on me, America could get them to pick me up for it, couldn't they? So why don't they? You know," he said, not without a touch of pride, "a cop can become the most famous cop in the world here, if he can nab me. Well, don't people realize that?" The waiter brought the orders, and we assaulted the spaghetti. "Look, I face facts," he said. "I can't go back. So why don't they just leave me alone?" His tone was not plaintive. "I just want to be another guy minding my own business." He said he had stressed this attitude to newspapermen, and they had printed dishonest stories about him. "They make it all up. So then you talk to them, to give it to them straight. And still they make it all up. Fiction writers." We finished the spaghetti, and the seafood came. "You know, I'm in the almanac," he said, with the fixed smile. "Yeah, look it up. Me in the almanac. 50 years. I got the biggest sentence ever given for white slavery. The others get 2, 5, maybe 10 tops. But me, 50. He chuckled softly. I asked Luciano about the commutation of this sentence. Was it because, as he still insists, he was innocent? "Could be," he said. "Was it because the 30 to 50-year sentence had been too severe?" "Maybe that too," he said. "Or was it because, as rumour, never confirmed, had it, he was of some assistance to the Allied armies in the invasion of Italy?" He smiled and flicked his wrist to dismiss the topic. The two girls, one American and the other Luciano's, sat facing each other, chatting softly. Luciano's girl was the younger of the two. She's attractive and speaks English fluently, but prefers to speak Italian to Luciano. She wore a wedding ring on her left hand, but they are not married. I got a lot of nephews and nieces. That's family enough for me, he said. And why should I bring my... He stumbled for a word. My grief to another person. I'm a clay pigeon. That Anslinger, with his announcements about me. Every time something happens, it's Luciano. I get the rap. Clay pigeon. Everybody who wants a headline can take a crack at me, and what can I do about it? Nothing. My history's against me. You can't beat history. His history includes a 6-month term for selling narcotics. I was a kid then. 17, 18, said Luciano blandly, as if it had been a common juvenile prank. Don't they figure that as you grow older, you get wiser? You grow out of one business into another? The businesses he grew into, he had told the special rackets prosecutor who cross-examined him, Tom Dewey, were bookmaking, horse betting, and the operating of gambling rooms. When I was in Haiti last spring, I heard rumors that the gambling concessions at the casino in Port-au-Prince were controlled by Luciano. The manager of the place admitted to me that the gambling rooms were operated by a syndicate of Italians. Luciano now told me that when he went to Cuba, shortly after he was deported from the United States, it was his dream to obtain a concession in one of the gambling casinos, work 4 months a year, and spend the other 8 playing golf. This dream was shattered when he was ordered to leave Cuba. Later, he heard of new opportunities in Venezuela, but, he said, he received official warning to stay out of the hemisphere. Luciano had admitted under cross-examination by Dewey that from the time he was 18, he had no legitimate occupation. Bootlegging was one of his enterprises, but he felt no guilt about this one. The guilt, if any, was national, he said. Everybody was as guilty as I was in them years. Whichever side of the bar you was on, behind it selling, or in front of it buying, you was breaking the law. Same thing, right? I dissented and suggested that there was no equality of guilt, because the bootleggers were violating the law for profit, and the consumers were not. We began to discuss profits and moralities, and soon I had to leave. Luciano said, hesitatingly, that he assumed everything had been off the record. I suggested that we discuss it further, perhaps the following day, for surely most of what he had said was not in any way damaging. Then I asked, "What plans do you have?" I meant plans for our meeting again. Plans? What kind of plans can a guy in my spot have? Mañana y mañana. If it rains tomorrow, I get an umbrella. Plans. I took my wife and sons to Capri the next morning. We returned at dusk, and a few minutes later the phone rang. "Mr. Lyons, this is Luciano. You ready?" Luciano and I went to the Z Teresa again. Luciano's companions, the 2 girls and the short, baldish man, had gone to the opera. He told the waiter that the others would join us after the opera. He frowned at the mention of the opera and said he had gone to the track. I told them I'd be back too late to make the opera, he said. I could have made it, but I don't like going there. We discussed our conversation of the previous evening, and he agreed that I could print it if I wished, with only a few deletions. Talk of the mafia or of links to present gang leaders he dismissed with his flick of the wrist gesture. Fiction writers, he said. I asked about his wealth. I read where I'm supposed to be a millionaire, he said. I wished it was true. His venture into bootlegging came too late to make him rich, said Luciano. It cost him $18 a case, and he sold it at $20 a case. By the time I got through with payoffs, there was almost nothing left, he said. And don't forget it's been 16 years since I'm out of action, with nothing going for me. But I'm all right. A small apartment, a 48 olds, and I brought some money too. I mentioned the rumors that he owned gambling places in America. Nothing. Not a piece of anything, he said. He stared at me, because he knew I still had doubts. Even a modest manner of living takes money. Friends, he said, smiling, sometimes bring him gifts of money. He smiled again. I suggested that if he had a legitimate business, there would be less speculation about the sources of his income. He had tried, he said, with 2 business investments in Italy, but he had lost. When propositions come to me, I got to weigh them carefully, said Luciano. I got to figure what's the pitch. I got to figure, will they be able to say it's bad? I brought up the matter of Italy's flourishing movie industry as an illustration of the opportunities still available. I referred to Orson Welles' project, a film production of Julius Caesar in modern dress, as a specific example. An English company had just withdrawn its promise to supply the financing, and Welles wanted to complete the film before MGM could release its own version of the play. What does a thing like that cost? Said Luciano casually. About 150 or 200,000, I said. 200,000. Huh. Luciano grunted and smacked the wind to dismiss the thought. He noticed a Neapolitan boy about 7 years old walking along the bay front. He was that boy's age, he said, when his family brought him from Italy to New York's East Side. Now, they dump me here and say this is where I belong. They might as well have dumped me in China and said China was my home. But, again the fixed smile, I'm here. So I'm here. His father, he said, was naturalized in New York. I remembered, somewhat vaguely, that under the law then in effect, those who were brought to America when they were minors became citizens if their father were naturalized before they reached legal age. If you were a citizen of the United States, as the son of a naturalized citizen, then you could have stopped them from deporting you, I said. But then if you weren't deported, you'd have had to serve the balance of your sentence, 40 more years. He waved his hand sharply. I hesitated before trying the cliché. Wouldn't you rather be in a jail in America than live the way you're living here? Nuts, Luciano answered. I heard a man say that once. I told him he was off his rocker. The law, said Luciano, is full of holes. It depends on whether they're for you or against you. They can blow through those holes either way, either way. Now take Frank. The newspapers that day had reported Frank Costello's fruitless attempt to be released under bail until the United States Supreme Court could decide on the legality of his conviction for contempt of Congress. Luciano discussed the legal technicalities involved in Costello's application before Justice Jackson. But it was Frank, so they turned him down, he said. The law is full of holes. They don't get you for what you done. They get you for some other things you done, which they couldn't prove. Take Capone, income tax rap. It was for them other things Capone did. Take Costello. Contempt? Nah. Other things they couldn't pin on him. Take me. White slavery. Me? The reference to Capone's income tax case stirred the memory of his own tax problem. When I was getting up in the limelight, said Luciano, I figured I'd better pay up my taxes. He and his lawyers visited the office of the Collector of Internal Revenue and filed income tax returns for the 6 previous years, plus interest. The revenue agent asked him how he had arrived at his figures. I gamble, Luciano explained to him. I'm a gambler. That's my profession. I know what I had to start with. I know what I've got now. I know what it cost me to live. The difference is profits, earnings. He paused. You know what the tax guy says to me? He says, believe it or not, he got to take my word for it. The matter was deemed closed, he continued, until he was an inmate of Dannemora prison, when he was visited by an examiner for the New York State Tax Bureau, who reminded Luciano he had failed to pay state income taxes for the 6 years on which he paid the federal tax. He wanted 4,000 interest and penalties. I wouldn't pay. I figure I'm in for 50 years. So what can they do to me if I don't pay? the State Tax Bureau sent a second emissary to him a few years later. Penalties and accrued interest had increased the claim. "So now it's about 45 years I got to go," Luciano said. "With that bigger stretch ahead, what more could they do to me?" But after he had served 10 years and heard that Governor Dewey might commute his sentence, he decided to settle his other accounts with the people of the state of New York. "A friend of mine paid it for me," he said, smiling, and declined to name the friend. The question of his finances was revived in Italy when he tried to nationalize an American automobile. He said he had bought from one of his friends. It was the 1948 Oldsmobile he still drives. Nationalizing a foreign car so that legal title can pass to the Italian citizen to whom it's delivered is an involved process. Luciano tried to simplify it, he said, by gifts to civil servants. Then that Anslinger began making announcements again, and I was picked up in the car. The arresting police questioned him about his means of support. He told them he had brought funds from America. They asked him how much he had brought, and Luciano said it was $25,000 in cash and some traveller's checks. He admitted that he had failed to declare the money upon entering the country, but explained that he was given no opportunity to do so. "They threw me in a jail as soon as I landed," he told them. He was asked where he had exchanged his dollars and traveller's checks for lira. "Oh, around. Just around," he answered. The police asked about further sources of income, and he told them about his generous friends from America. These funds, too, he had cashed around. In Italy, as in most nations troubled by dollar shortages and black markets, it is illegal to bring in undeclared money. It is also illegal to exchange foreign currency or American Express checks at places other than recognized banks or institutions. Luciano was fined $14,000. His funds, he said, have also been tapped by handouts to half of the 400 or so deportees now living in Naples. "If I had the dough," said Luciano, "I'd start a factory and hire just the deportees." He expressed sympathy for their plight. Dumped into Italy, he said, a land few remember, with little money and little hope, separated from their families in America. "I can understand if any of them deportees turn to dope peddling," he said. I asked him whether the gangster tie-ups of these deportees would make it difficult for them to break away and try legitimate business. "Nah," he said, "that's just for the books and movies. Fiction. A guy wants to get out of a mob. Easy. Just move. Just change your name and move. Nobody's got handcuffs on you. Why should anybody try to bother you? The fact that you move away where you think nobody's going to find you, or change your name, is proof you don't want to hurt them, ain't it? Nah, books and movies." He lit his cigarette, an American cigarette. The lighter bore his initials. CL. I stared at it, thinking that mine, initialed LL, might be more appropriate. I asked him how he happened to be called Lucky instead of Charlie. "I came back from a ride," he said. 4 men took him on that ride. They was no hoodlums, he repeated. They had picked him up in New Jersey and, he said, demanded to know the whereabouts of a certain guy. They warned him that they would kill him, and when they began to beat him in earnest, he fought back. I decided to make a commotion. I broke the window of the car. They dumped me and left me for dead. He held up his chin and showed me the long scar. He pointed to his upper lip to another scar. My teeth came through. He had crawled to the roadway and hailed the first passing car. It was a police car. "That was my tough break," said Luciano. The policeman asked him what had happened, and Luciano, bleeding from the throat and body wounds, said, "Nothing happened. Nothing at all. Take me to a taxi." He thought he was still in New Jersey, where he had influence. He discovered that he was in Staten Island. They put me in the line-up. Me, with bandages around my head so I looked like one of them Egyptian mummies. They asked me who done it. I told them it was no hoodlums. The papers called me lucky. A few days after my return to New York, I met a former FBI man who was familiar with Luciano's history. Did he talk about being taken for a ride by 4 cops? He said. He told me that Luciano had been courting the sister of a Harlem policeman who was unable to disrupt the romance and finally decided that only the most drastic measures could bring him satisfaction. The cop enlisted the aid of 3 colleagues who felt his plans would enhance the welfare of the community. They took Luciano for a ride. I remembered the way Luciano laughed when he indicated that he had got satisfactory revenge, and I asked if he had later sent his minions, as any moviegoer would expect, to knock off the cops. "Not at all," said the former FBI man. "One of the quartets died a natural death. Another retired from the police force. Luciano's revenge was directed against the 2 who remained policemen, and it had to wait until he had risen to a position of influence in New York. Then he struck. He had the 2 policemen transferred to the beat farthest from their homes, Staten Island. Again, Luciano returned to Commissioner Anslinger and his repeated reminders that Luciano is still alive and thriving. "I don't like this publicity, this," he groped for the word, "notoriety. Maybe if it was the other way round, like glory, I'd like it." I suggested that if he were to retire to a simple life, such as farming, the spotlight might be turned away. "Me? A farmer? I thought of doing that many times," said Luciano. "So what would happen? They'd still be saying Luciano is giving the orders. Even if I was in jail, they'd still be saying Luciano is head of a dope ring. When I'm dead, they'll start kicking somebody else." He held up his fingers and began counting off. First it was Capone, then me, now Frank, next Tommy. Frank was Costello, of course, and Tommy was Thomas Lucchese, known as Three-Finger Tommy Brown. Later in the year, the government started proceedings to deport him. "Publicity," Luciano snickered. "All I want them to do is leave me alone." We ordered more coffee. I mentioned the matter of regret. "Nah, nothing. No regrets," he said. "Anything I ever did in my life I felt justified in doing. I never abused nobody in my life." I asked about the 4 men who had taken him for a ride, assuming at that time that he had repaid them in kind. Luciano laughed. "If people abuse me, and I abuse them back, that ain't abuse. Yeah. I'm sorry about one thing, though. This." He pointed to tattoo marks on both his forearms. He ran his curled fingers over the tattoos, one of a nude and the other of his monogram framed in an entwined pattern. To him, they were damned spots which would not go out. "I tried taking them off and went to doctors about it. Couldn't. I was a kid then." He shrugged. "Can't wear short-sleeve shirts." The 2 ladies and the short, baldish man arrived and seated themselves at the table. They were solicitous about his day at the racetrack. "I done okay," he told them, then asked about the opera. They said it was enjoyable. I asked the short, baldish man how it compared with the opera in America. "It's better in America," he replied. Luciano whispered something to his girl. She reached across the table and pinched his cheek, hard. He drew back, smiling, as if pleased that he had drawn fire, but she held on to his cheek and began to mimic his words, accenting the first one sardonically. "Everything's better in America. Everything's better in America. Everything's better in America. Everything's better in America." It was more than injury to her national pride. Perhaps it was something personal. Luciano beamed at her outburst. She released his cheek, and they both began to laugh. I got up to leave and said that I had a busy schedule for the next day, to Pompeii then to Admiral Carney's office for a luncheon, and on to Vesuvius. "Watch out at Pompeii," Luciano warned me. "Keep your family away from them pictures they got there. It's not for kids." I had heard of the house and of the obscene pictures there. "And don't waste your time at Vesuvius," said Luciano. "Nothing's there. It's dead. You get up there and you see nothing. Solfatara is better. That's a live volcano, erupting all the time. It's nearer too. I'll take you tomorrow. In the afternoon, huh? I'll call you." I took my wife and sons to Pompeii the next morning. I was careful to veer them away from the house Luciano had described, the house into which tittering tourists were streaming. We were late getting back. Admiral Carney's car was waiting to take me to Hafsi, headquarters, Allied Forces, Southern Europe. The luncheon took longer than I had expected. When I returned to the Excelsior, the porter told me my family had gone out. I went upstairs, and a minute later, Luciano was on the phone. "You ready?" he asked. I wrote a note for my wife. "Lucky Luciano is taking me for a ride. Be back soon." Then I took my movie camera, a small one which fits into my pocket, and went downstairs. He was at the wheel of the 1948 Oldsmobile sedan. The short, baldish man got into the back of the car, and I sat up front. We drove along winding mountain roads, and Luciano slowed up to take 2 letters from his pocket and hand them to me. The first was from the Jones boys, NBC TV's twin photographers, who had persuaded him to pose for their television film. At first, he had resisted their pleas, but one of the twins finally told Luciano that his wife was going to have a baby, and that NBC TV had just fired both of them for not getting shots of the famous exile. "Sob stuff." Luciano smiled. "I knew they was making it up and putting one over on me, but I posed." The second letter was from a magazine interviewer. He wrote that the editor who had given him his assignment had returned his manuscript, suggesting he make it a tougher piece. He'd tried twice, but the editor still felt the word portrait was not evil enough. The piece, therefore, would not appear in the National Weekly. We reached Solfatara, and Luciano parked the car and called for a guide. The gatekeeper knew Luciano, and so did the guide. As we walked up the path to the volcano, the short, baldish man asked about my camera. He had never seen a movie camera that small, he said. I handed it to him and showed him where the finder was. He peered through it at Luciano. "Now press the button back," I said. He did, and the film started running. Luciano presented his fixed smile, then said, "That's enough footage for one shot. You don't want to waste film." He prodded the guide into demonstrating that the ground under our feet was very thin. "Throw the rock," he said. The guide heaved a large rock over his head. It thumped to earth and made a hollow sound. "The fire bit," Luciano said. The guide put a match to a rolled-up newspaper, then waved the burning paper in front of a recess in the crater. Smoke began to pour from it, and from every hole for half a mile around. "Watch this," said Luciano. He crouched and blew across the tip of his lit cigarette, directly at a crater hole. It drew smoke from every crevice. I asked him to do it again, and photographed him. We walked to the car and started the drive back. It was an unpaved road, and the gateman shouted at him in Italian. "What did the man say?" I asked. Luciano translated. "He said I should slow down. I'm raising too much dust. Yeah, maybe I am. Maybe I always did." He mentioned Commissioner Anslinger's name only once during the drive back. "I'll outlive him," he said. "I'll outlive them all. You asked my plans? There's my plans. To outlive them." In a 1953 interview, he had a notably more positive outlook on life, business operations, and his financial situation. However, by the time he gave an interview to Confidential magazine in 1959, his perspective had shifted significantly. Despite maintaining connections with various organized crime members back in America, new issues had arisen. Vito Genovese's ambitions, Carlo Gambino's rise, and the impending fall of Cuba were causing significant upheaval in the world of organized crime. This turmoil particularly affected the Jewish mafia, led by Meyer Lansky, the Corsican mafia, and the Italian-American mafia. By this period, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, Naval Intelligence, and other government agencies were collaborating with organized crime to combat communism. From 1959 onwards, the focus shifted to fighting Castro, and by 1961, the Kennedy administration was confronting these dangerous figures. These men were not only influential industrial leaders, but also key players in organized crime, effectively forming a second government that wielded significant power over America and its industries. They had deeply infiltrated and corrupted various facets of American society. Ironically, the Kennedy administration, which aimed to dismantle their power, had been brought to power with the very assistance of these criminal entities. Charlie Lucky, Luciano, did not outlive his enemies. Unfortunately, towards the end of his life, the world of organized crime began to turn against him during extremely fraught times. The Kennedy administration was aggressively targeting organized crime, challenging foundational elements like omertà. With multiple informants cooperating with the FBI and the Justice Department, the cracks in the syndicate, originally created by Luciano in the 1930s, started to show. This surge of revelations and mounting stress took a toll on Luciano. In 1962, he suffered a fatal heart attack at Naples airport. Following Luciano's death, the old guard of organized crime also began to pass away. Henry Anslinger died in 1975 and Vito Genovese in 1969. Frank Costello passed in 1973 at the age of 82, 2 years after Joe Adonis's death in 1971. In 1959, Longy Zwilman was murdered, and Tommy Lucchese succumbed to a brain tumor in 1966. This marked the end of an era, with each of these figures meeting their demise in the years following Luciano's sudden death. The news of Luciano's death was quickly followed by detailed reports, the first of which appeared the very next day. This article came out the next day and was written by Associated Press. Heart attack kills. Lucky Luciano, 64, Naples, Italy, AP. Charles Lucky. Luciano, wealthy ex-American underworld czar who was kicked out of the United States in 1946, died of an apparent heart attack yesterday while being trailed by Italian narcotics detectives. Luciano was 64. The shadowing detectives were reported acting on a tip in a renewed effort to stop the dope traffic. The luck ascribed to Luciano by his nickname, after he survived a gangland ride ordered by rival hoodlums, ran out at Naples Capodichino Airport. In Washington, Henry Giordano, Deputy Commissioner of the U.S. Narcotics Bureau, indicated Luciano had been facing imminent arrest by Italian authorities who were tying up the loose ends of a $150 million international dope ring smashed in New York last year. Giordano declined to speculate whether Luciano headed the ring, but said, "We were ready to move against him with the Italian authorities." Charles Luciano. Luciano was stricken after a meeting with Martin Gosch, who identified himself as an American movie producer who had flown from Rome to talk about a planned motion picture on Luciano's life. Luciano, dapper in blue jacket and grey flannel slacks, was walking with Gosch from the terminal building to his American car when police who were trailing him saw him seize the American's arm. "Martin, Martin," he muttered, and fell to the sidewalk. A doctor called from the airport infirmary said he died instantly. Although Luciano was believed to have suffered a heart attack, authorities ordered an autopsy to confirm the cause of death. He had been living in this southern Italian city under police surveillance almost since he was shipped from New York after serving 10 years of a 30-year sentence for white slavery. Convicted of extorting protection money from prostitutes, he said in later life that it was the only thing I never did. Rumored to the end to be one of the big men in international crime, he was picked up by detectives every once in a while for questioning about art thefts, narcotics rings, and other shady activities. But they always let him go. He had lots of money. He lived well in penthouse apartments, had a flashy wardrobe, and a penchant for visiting racetracks. Luciano's almost constant companion for years was Igea Lissoni, a honey-haired Italian. Thomas E. Dewey, who as a crime-busting prosecutor brought about Luciano's conviction under a 62-count compulsory prostitution indictment in 1936, called him the most dangerous and important racketeer in New York, if not in the country. 10 years later, as governor of New York, Dewey pardoned Luciano and ordered him deported on the grounds that he never had citizenship papers. Luciano claimed he got the pardon because he helped the U.S. Navy in some way during the Sicilian invasion of World War II. Luciano was a native of Sicily. He was one of 5 children of a carpenter who migrated to Manhattan's East Side when the future gangster was 8. Charlie Lucky Luciano died in Naples, Italy, a place he had longed to leave behind to return to New York, the city he considered his true home. Despite his wishes, it was his former associates, some of whom had once betrayed him, who were tasked with bringing his body back to America for burial. His remains were displayed for the public first in Italy, then in New York, drawing the attention of many, including Robert F. Kennedy. Kennedy was keenly aware of Luciano's criminal empire and was poised to expose La Cosa Nostra's secrets within a year. The article you're about to read details the events leading up to Luciano's death. Under investigation for a suspected narcotics deal, Luciano maintained his innocence, claiming that he was merely speaking with a well-respected, well-publicized author. However, federal agents, suspecting the individual was a narcotics trafficker, closely monitored Luciano. They planned to accompany him to a meeting they thought might lead to a significant bust, intending to arrest both Luciano and his contact. But before the agents could act, Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack at the airport, a tragic end compounded by stress, the loss of his wife, and the grim recognition of his isolated demise in Italy. Despite being vilified as a pimp, narcotics trafficker, and dangerous gangster, Luciano's more commendable deeds went largely unrecognized in the shadow of his infamy. Naples, Italy. Italian narcotics investigators Saturday studied every possible link the international underworld may have had with the late Charles Lucky Luciano since the United States deported him to Italy in 1946. An autopsy must be performed on the 64-year-old New York vice king, fatally stricken Friday night at Naples' Capodichino airport, before his body can be released for burial. Luciano had just met an American producer, arriving for final talks on a movie about his life, when he collapsed from an apparent heart attack and died. Suddenly Lucky put his arms around me, producer Martin A. Gosch said Saturday. His eyes began to roll. "Charlie," I asked him, "what's wrong with you?" He fell forward in my arms and died without uttering a word. Police here had kept their eye on Luciano since he arrived nearly 16 years ago, but their surveillance intensified after a $150 million narcotics ring was smashed in the United States last year. A U.S. Narcotics Bureau official indicated in Washington, after getting word of Luciano's death, that the arrest of the underworld character in Naples had been imminent. Gosch lives in Madrid, where 3 fugitives facing U.S. narcotics charges were arrested just 4 days ago. They are Frank Caruso, 50, Vincent Mauro, 45, and Salvatore Maneri, 49. Italian authorities said Caruso and Mauro were known associates of Luciano. Met an agent. Gosch said Luciano was with another man when they met at the airport, and Luciano introduced the man as a friend. Gosh said he learned later the friend was Italian narcotics agent Cesare Retta, assigned to watch Luciano's every activity closely. Gosh said Retta told him later Luciano had recently suffered a heart attack. The producer said he first met Luciano in October 1960. He gave Luciano a complete movie script in February 1961 for his approval. Luciano initialed every page, Gosh said. American actor Cameron Mitchell was chosen last month to portray Luciano on the screen, Gosh told newsmen. He added that filming was originally to have started months ago. But I am in no position to say why the production was stopped. He said shooting now has been set for September in Naples. A New York court sentenced Luciano in 1936 to 30 to 50 years in prison for white slavery, charging him with running a protection racket for prostitutes. He was released and deported after 10 years behind bars.